Okay, good morning, everybody. Hope all doing well. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. Give me just a moment. We'll get that sharing. All right, so we now have a new module. New module here is death and dying, and what we're going to be doing here is a number of interesting things. So let's take a look at that. Primarily, this module is going to be discussing a couple of major ethical issues surrounding death, mainly what death is and some implications of that. What is death and what are the implications of that? There are a lot of ethical issues around death and dying, but that's primarily what we're going to talk about. My lecture will be right here once I'm done with it. And there are some other videos here. You can see there's a little explanation of each video on top here, and then a question to think about after you watch each of these videos. The first one is on assisted suicide or physician-assisted suicide or death, and whether you think people should have a right to die if they're terminally ill. Second is a little bit on when we actually die medically and legally and how that works and what you think about that. And the last video is on whether or not people in a permanent vegetative state are still there or not. If your mind's gone, are you really dead, or something like that? And those questions you don't have to write an answer to. They're not assigned questions. They're questions to think about for each video. And then you have a discussion, right? Your discussion says, what is death? Are we dead only when our entire body, heart and lungs included, die? Or I got a couple of typos there, so let's edit my typos as we go through it here. Heart and lungs included, or is the death of the brain enough to make you dead? And if the brain is enough, does it need to be the entire brain or just those parts of the brain that allow us to think and be self-aware? Is someone in a permanent vegetative state alive? Explain what you think and why. Use an example to support your view. You don't need to reply to another student on this topic, but you may if you'd like to. Okay, so that's the assignment there. And let's save that with the typos fixed. And I do have a PowerPoint that we'll pull up here. And so let's do that on when is somebody dead. And just got to get the slideshow up and running here. And okay, so let's run over the options here and just kind of see how that goes. So you'll see this a little bit in the video I provided on when is a person dead or the moment of death. It's pretty much about this. And so what you get here is there's a pre-modern concept that we won't talk too much about called vitalism. The idea that there's some special kind of mystical spark that animates everything, some special something that animates life. It's kind of a mystical life force. That's a pre-scientific, pre-modern medicine kind of concept. And so that's not entirely a helpful thing. So we don't really need to think about that too much. It's not that it's not true or you can't believe it or something like that. It's just that's not what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to stick to the scientific and legal definition of death. You might believe in something like a soul, and death is when your soul leaves the body. But that, of course, is a religious idea, and you're perfectly free to believe it could be true. But that's kind of hard to measure. How do you know when to do that? And that so it can't really help with medical and legal decisions. So we've got to look at physiological criteria. How would a doctor be able to tell that this living patient is now dead, is now a corpse? So that's why we're going to stick with medical and legal type definitions of death. And here are the three of them. The three options historically. Traditionally, there's been cardiorespiratory or pulmonary, cardiopulmonary. And that just means your heart and your lungs stop and they don't start again. Irreversible is common to all three, right? If you're dead, you don't come back, not by natural means anyway. You don't come back, you're gone. You don't revive. Cardiorespiratory means your heart and lungs stops. That was the major definition of death until the mid-20th century when technology got advanced. More on that in a minute. The current legal and medical definition just about everywhere is whole brain death. And so that's the current definition of death, whole brain death. And of course, Higher brain death means the parts of your brain that are associated with thinking, your cerebral cortex, the higher parts of your brain, those gray, wrinkly stuff on the top of your brain. More about that later as well. Okay, more on that option 3 later. The current legal and medical definition is option 2. But again, all of these things stop. It's the irreversible cessation, and they don't start again. Okay, so let's move on and look at each of these a little more closely. So as I mentioned, when medicine first became kind of a discipline and a science a few centuries ago, heart and lung death was the way you could tell if someone was dead. No pulse, no heartbeat, no breathing. But by the mid 20th century, this became at least partially problematic because things like CPR and defibrillators were invented. So we could actually bring people back from heart and lung death. But it seems pretty weird to say we're raising the dead, right? Even more, we can keep someone alive with a fake heart or briefly on a machine without a heart and lungs. But we can transplant organs, we can transplant the heart and lungs. But most importantly of all is number 4 here, we can keep your heart and lungs working even when your brain is dead. So there were patients kept alive by machines, the machine keep the heart going and the lungs pumping for years, where the brain is literally completely dead. There's nothing going on in the brain, no activity of any kind, no blood flow, nothing. And the brain is literally decaying. The rest of the body's alive. That's not really a living person, right? The body's artificially alive. So what happened was in the 50s and 60s, a lot of research was done, some reports were filed. And by the 1980s, pretty much the legal definition of death everywhere became whole brain death. And that is to this day, almost everywhere in the world, the legal and medical definition of death is whole brain death. And just to be clear what whole brain death means. Whole brain death means the irreversible cessation of all activity of the entire brain. No electrical activity in the higher brain, no blood flow, no oxygen. It's like somebody took a big old breaker switch and just turned everything off. That brain is completely dead. So even though the body might be kept alive by machines, the brain is gone. And that's the current legal definition of death. Now, there are a couple of states, New York and New Jersey, where you could say, I don't want this definition applied to me. And you could specifically have a written document that says, I want the older heart-lung definition of death attributed to me. If you do that, you have a special exception. You could be considered alive even if you're brain dead. But apart from that, this is the definition of death. Apart from those special cases where people live in like New York and New Jersey and they've said, I want this. This is the definition. There are some, however, who think it's actually too restrictive and want what they call the higher definition of death. And the higher brain definition of death would be, sorry, flying through the things there, would be, I don't have it written here, but it would just be if part of your brain is alive, but that part of your brain isn't part of what helps you think, then you lose that part of your brain that allows you to think, and you're gone, even if your body is alive. So let me explain. Just as a machine could keep your heart and lungs going and the blood flow going through your body, there's a part of your brain, namely the brain stem, that can do that. The brain stem only controls those sort of automatic functions. The brain stem can't do very much, some minor reflexes and breathing and heartbeat. That's it. So the brain stem has vegetative functions only. And there are people who sustain serious brain injuries and enter what's called a permanent vegetative state. And in this permanent vegetative state, such people lose all consciousness, as far as we know. It means everything in their brain is destroyed and irreversibly and dead, except for the brain stem. That's what a permanent vegetative state means. It's called higher brain death. And it means that all that is left of them is their purely automatic vegetative functions. There is no self-awareness, there is no thinking, there's no person left there. There's a living body, but the mind that was there is totally destroyed. And some people would like to say that person is dead and gone, even though their body is alive. That's not legal, the legal definition of death anywhere, but some people think it ought to be, right? If we could prove beyond the shadow of a doubt that all that's left of your brain is your brain stem, well, then that's that. right? So that's the idea. Okay, so let's consider that as an option. So here's the current legal and medical definition. Some say I'd rather have the older heart-lung definition applied to me. Some say this is actually a little too restrictive. If all you got left is a brainstem, that's a dead person too. So it's kind of criticized on two sides, but that's the legal and medical definition. Now, what's important here in figuring out which one of these views you hold? Do you hold the cardiorespiratory, where it's heart and lung, the whole brain, where it's everything, including the brain stem, or the higher brain, where it's everything other than the brain stem? That depends. What makes us us? When we lose that, does that mean we're dead? All right, what makes us us? And philosophers have long had a fancy term for this: a person. We human beings are persons. And we can actually get rid of this part of this here, by the way. So let's do that. You don't really need this part in parentheses. So let's take care of that there. And go back to the slideshow here. So what's a person? A person is a philosophical term. Now, we might think of it as just another word for human being, but philosophers mean it in a more technical and kind of precise way. It's a functional term. A person is a creature, a being, that can reason abstractly and be self-aware. So what does that mean? Reason abstractly means you could count, you can add, you can subtract, you can recognize that a painting represents other things. It's an image of something, things like that, okay? And so that kind of stuff, you can count, you can read, you can understand language, you can use language. That's abstract reasoning. You can appreciate music. That's what it means. Right? Even small children can do that, but most animals can't. And be self-aware. You have a very strong sense of self. You know that you are this particular individual and you relate in specific ways to other individuals. You can recognize yourself in a mirror. Oh, that's me. You can recognize, you can put yourself out in a photograph. Again, most animals and babies can't do that. It takes a while. So that's what a person is. And any being that could do that, human or otherwise, would be a person in the philosophical sense, right? So a person need not necessarily be a biological human. If there are aliens, extraterrestrials on another planet out there, which there very well could be, if that's the case, then those would be persons. If they have civilizations and they talk and they have organized society, they would be persons. Some animals, particularly great apes like chimps, orangutans, they seem to have enough abstract reasoning capacity and self-awareness that they might count. If we ever created a machine that truly thought, artificial intelligence, true artificial intelligence, it would be a mechanical person. Because a person is just a being that can do these two things. Right? It doesn't matter what its biology is. Right? So there could be. You think of comic book characters like Superman. He's a person, even though he's not a human. He's from Krypton. It's fictional. But if there were such a being, that he'd be a person, even though he's not biologically human. But on the flip side, right, there could be biological humans that are not persons anymore. So, for example, people in a persistent vegetative state are PVS. And people in a persistent vegetative state are PVS. That is somebody who has suffered such a severe brain injury. And there are a number of ways you could have it: an accident, a medical issue that causes you to have a major stroke or heart problem and catch oxygen off your brain, where all that is left functioning is your brainstem. And all the parts of your brain associated with thinking, being aware, that kind of stuff is destroyed. That's a persistent vegetative state, a permanent, irreversible reduction to a non-thinking, non-aware state. That would be a living human body, but the person would be gone, destroyed. So you'd have a human being that's not a person, just as you could have persons, on this view of what a person is. So that means this: on this view that I'm describing, we got to recognize a difference between the person and the biological organism. And on this view, we are the person, not merely the organism. So the death of the person is the death of us. And this is the higher brain death. If my personality, if the person that is me is gone, if my mind is gone, I'm gone. Even if my body lives for years. What matters is being alive biographically, having a self, being aware, thinking, and not just biologically. So that's the argument for higher brain depth. Okay, let's see what we think of it and see how it cashes out. In 1992, these are some examples of this argument. So what are some examples of somebody who's human but not a person? In 1992, in Florida, there was a baby born named baby Teresa. Baby Teresa, that's what she called her. She was born with anencephaly. And as you can see from this image, infants born with anencephaly have most of their brain missing. They pretty much just have a brain stem. And that means that they're totally vegetative. They don't have a mind. They don't have a mental life. They don't have a self. It's a very tragic thing. It's an extraordinarily rare genetic defect. Most of them don't make it to birth. Most of them die in the womb. When they do make it to birth, they die within minutes or hours. An extremely rare few live days. Astronomically rare few live weeks. They don't live years. And when I say live, they just sit there like in a vegetative state. They don't do anything. So any baby born with anencephaly is going to die. It's quite a disturbing thing. They're not going to live. And they're not ever going to be awake. They're never going to be aware. Based on what we call the person, there isn't a person there. There's briefly a living body, but there's never a mind. Baby Teresa's parents decided to go through with the pregnancy and have her. In 1992 in Florida, they could have had an abortion, different ethical issue, but they could have. And chose not to. The reason they chose not to, they thought if Teresa made it to birth, maybe they could take Teresa's organs, give them to other babies. And then Teresa's life could mean something. Her life could save other babies. Her liver, her kidneys, her eyes, her skin. She could heal babies with terrible defects. She could save babies' lives with her vital organs. And then her life would not only mean something, she would live on in these other babies. Okay, the doctors agreed, but they had to ask the court to give permission because here's why. If you wait until baby Teresa dies, her organs would be useless. Organs deteriorate extremely rapidly after the moment of death because blood flow is gone. And if you sit there and wait for a body to die, there's almost no way the organs will be usable because they'll have been slowly deteriorating. So the only way to be able to take her organs and make sure they were all in good shape was to remove them while her body was still alive. The court ruled you couldn't do that because she's a living human being and you're not allowed to take vital organs from a living human being. You have to wait till she dies. So they had to wait till she died. When she died 9 days later, her organs couldn't be used. They couldn't transplant them. And the huge debate at the time was this: should we have taken her organs? Think a couple of things here. Is baby Teresa really alive? There isn't a person there. There's no mind. It's a living human body, but no mind. In fact, there's not a being even capable of feeling pain. The parts of the brain that sense things, that have any senses, that can see, hear, feel, they're all in this part of the brain that Teresa doesn't have. She can't feel pain. She can't feel anything. So removing her organs couldn't cause pain, couldn't harm her. She's going to die soon anyway. There, in a way, maybe there really isn't a she, right? There isn't a person there. So you could argue, I don't know if baby Teresa's meaningfully alive. And that's what the doctors kind of claimed. They told the court, is this baby really alive? Is this really a living person? I'll let you decide for yourself what you think of whether they should have taken the organs of baby Teresa, but the question depends upon, if you only have your brainstem, are you genuinely alive? So the moment of death has huge implications there. If you just have a brainstem and there's no mind, is there a person there? And if there isn't, does that mean baby Teresa isn't really a living person? And if she isn't, does that mean we can take her organs? Another case, which was very, very fantastically debated at the time, was Terri Schiavo. Terri Schiavo case was, and you have a video on it. One of the videos I pointed out to you goes into a little bit of detail on Terri Schiavo and others in a permanent vegetative state. She was in a permanent vegetative state. In 1990, Ms. Schiavo had a massive, she was very young, 26, but she had a potassium imbalance and she had a massive cardiac event. and she ended up being put on a breathe. She ended up being put on a feeding tube because she was declared in a persistent and then later a permanent vegetative state. So what happened was it was declared that her cerebral cortex, her higher brain, was irreversibly destroyed. And so Terry's mind, the person who was Terry, was gone. And that was declared in the 90s. They do a lot of tests over a long period of time, and they finally decided, yeah, there's no more awareness there. She's vegetative. Her husband eventually petitioned him to remove the feeding tube. The parents of Terri Schiavo argued against this, and it went to court, to Congress. I mean, it was a big political legal issue for several years. And eventually the courts again and again and again and again and again ruled in favor of the husband. Her feeding tube was removed and her body finally died in 2005. In 2005, the autopsy did in fact confirm that her brain was dead except for the brainstem, right? The rest of her brain was gone. It was just all that was left was the brainstem. So she was functionally the same as baby Teresa. And this brings up similar questions, right? When did Terry die? Did Terry die in 1990 when her brain, later confirmed by the autopsy, was so damaged that the person who was Terry was gone? There's no mental life there anymore. There's no mind. Or did she die in 2005 when the feeding tube was removed and her body finally shut off, her liver, her kidneys, her heart, her lungs? It depends on your definition of death. Is it death of the person that matters or death of the organism? Is it whole brain or higher brain? What's death? When did Terry die? And there's also other issues there, right? Who gets to decide? Who represents her interest? Who was right? Her parents? Or what did Terry want? There's a lot there. You'll see more in the video. So that's my biomedical death. And biomedical death is profoundly important as well. There is another issue I want to spend a little bit on. And there is something besides biomedical death called social death. And biomedical death is what we've been talking about when we're talking about when is a person dead. And here we say a person is dead when the medical professionals say they are dead, on the basis of a specific cessation of some biological function. Okay, so heart and lung, higher brain, whole brain, that's biomedical death. That's what we've been talking about. There's also social death, which is more of an anthropological, communal kind of phenomenon. This is when a person is considered dead when their family and community recognize them as dead. Right now, you can be socially alive when biologically dead, right? You're medically speaking, this is a corpse, but the community doesn't recognize them as such. I'm going to show you an example of that in a minute. Or you can be socially dead but biologically alive, meaning you're no longer treated as if you're alive. This has been historically a problem with really badly, abusively run nursing homes, mental institutions, or homes for people with disabilities, which have been very cruel and very awful. It's often the way homeless people are treated, as if they didn't exist. They weren't really there. B goes way beyond our topic here about how we treat living people as if they aren't really living. It's horrible. I can't do it justice in so short a time, so I'll leave you to think about it and look it up. But I do want you to think a little bit about being socially alive while biologically dead. And I'm going to show you a little bit, perhaps, of a shocking example, but I'm going to show it to you. This is a culture that defines death very differently than us. I'm going to show you a video of it. And here we go. Let me get to the video. And this video is about people called the Tanya Toraja, the Torturajans in Indonesia. They have death rituals that are very different from ours. It may strike you as a quite different, but and a little shocking. But it is something that they do, and it should give you an idea of how social death can be quite different than biomedical death, And I'll show you the video, and then I'll leave you with a final thought on what to, and let you think about it.
I think it's safe to say that all humans will be intimate with death at least once in their lives. But what if that intimacy began long before you faced your own transition from life into death? What would life be like if the dead literally lived alongside you? In my husband's homeland, in the highlands of Sulawesi Island in eastern Indonesia, there is a community of people that experience death not as a singular event, but as a gradual social process. In Tanah Toraja, the most important social moments in people's lives, the focal points of social and cultural interaction, are not weddings or births or even family dinners, but funerals. So these funerals are characterized by elaborate rituals that tie people in a system of reciprocal debt based on the amount of animals, pigs, chickens, and most importantly, water buffalo, that are sacrificed and distributed in the name of the deceased. So this cultural complex surrounding death, the ritual enactment of the end of life, has made death the most visible and remarkable aspect of Toraja's landscape. Lasting anywhere from a few days to a few weeks, funeral ceremonies are a raucous affair where commemorating someone who's died is not so much a private sadness, but more of a publicly shared transition. And it's a transition that's just as much about the identity of the living as it is about remembrance of the dead. So every year, thousands of visitors come to Tanah Toraja to see, as it were, this culture of death. And for many people, these grandiose ceremonies and the length of the ceremonies are somehow incommensurable with the way that we face our own mortality in the West. So even as we share death as a universal experience, it's not experienced the same way the world over. And as an anthropologist, I see these differences in experience being rooted in the cultural and social worlds through which we define the phenomena around us. So where we see an unquestionable reality, death as an irrefutable biological condition, Torajans see the expired corporeal form as part of a larger social genesis. So again, the physical cessation of life is not the same as death. In fact, a member of society is only truly dead when the extended family can agree upon and marshal the resources necessary to hold a funeral ceremony that is considered appropriate in terms of resources for the status of the deceased. And this ceremony has to take place in front of the eyes of the whole community with everyone's participation. So after a person's physical death, their body is placed in a special room in the traditional residence, which is called the tongkonan. And the tongkonan is symbolic not only of the family's identity, but also of the human life cycle from birth to death. So essentially, the shape of the building that you're born into is the shape of the structure which carries you to your ancestral resting place. Until the funeral ceremony, which can be held years after a person's physical death, the deceased is referred to as to makala, a sick person, or to mama, a person who is asleep. And they continue to be a member of the household. They are symbolically fed and cared for, and the family at this time will begin a number of ritual injunctions which communicates to the wider community around them that one of their members is undergoing the transition from this life into the afterlife known as Puya. So I know what some of you must be thinking right now. Is she really saying that these people live with the bodies of their dead relatives? And that's exactly what I'm saying. But instead of giving in to this sort of visceral reaction we have to this idea of proximity to bodies, proximity to death, or how this notion just does not fit into our very biological or medical sort of definition of death, I like to think about what the Trajan way of viewing death encompasses of the human experience, but the medical definition leaves out. I think that Trajans socially recognize and culturally express what many of us feel to be true, despite the widespread acceptance of the biomedical definition of death. And that is that our relationships with other humans, their impact on our social reality doesn't cease with the termination of the physical processes of the body. That there's a period of transition as the relationship between the living and the dead is transformed, but not ended. So Trajans express this idea of this enduring relationship by lavishing love and attention on the most visible symbol of that relationship, the human body. So my husband has fond memories of talking to and playing with and generally being around his deceased grandfather. And for him, there is nothing unnatural about this. This is a natural part of the process as the family comes to terms with a transition in their relationship to the deceased. And this is the transition from relating to the deceased as a person who's living to relating to the deceased as a person who's an ancestor. And here you can see these wooden effigies of the ancestors. So these are people who have already been buried, already had a funeral ceremony. These are called tau tau. So the funeral ceremony itself embodies this relational perspective on death. It ritualizes the impact of death on families and communities. And it's also a moment of self-awareness. It's a moment when people think about who they are, their place in society, and their role in the life cycle in accordance with Trajan cosmology. There's a saying in Taraja that all people will become grandparents. And what this means is that after death, we all become part of the ancestral line that anchors us between the past and the present and will define who our loved ones are into the future. So essentially, we all become grandparents to the generations of human children that come after us. And this metaphor of membership in the greater human family is the way that children also describe the money that they invest in these sacrificial buffaloes that are thought to carry people's soul from here to the afterlife. And children will explain that they will invest the money in this because they want to repay their parents the debt for all of the years their parents spent investing and caring for them. But the sacrifice of buffalo and the ritual display of wealth also exhibits the status of the deceased, and by extension, the deceased's family. So at funerals, relationships are reconfirmed, but also transformed in a ritual drama that highlights the most salient feature about death in this place: its impact on life and the relationships of the living. So all of this focus on death doesn't mean that Trajans don't aspire to the ideal of a long life. They engage in many practices thought to confer good health and survival to an advanced age. But they don't put much stock in efforts to prolong life in the face of debilitating illness or in old age. It's said in Traja that everybody has sort of a predetermined amount of life. It's called the sunga. And like a thread, it should be allowed to unspool to its natural end. So by having death as a part of the cultural and social fabric of life, people's everyday decisions about their health and health care are affected. The patriarch of my husband's maternal clan, Nenek Kacha, is now approaching the age of 100 as far as we can tell. And there are increasing signs that he is about to depart on his own journey for Puya, and his death will be greatly mourned. But I know that my husband's family looks forward to the moment when they can ritually display what his remarkable presence has meant to their lives. When they can ritually recount his life's narrative, weaving his story into the history of their community. His story is their story. His funeral songs will sing them a song about themselves. And it's a story that has no discernible beginning, no foreseeable end. It's a story that goes on long after his body no longer does. People ask me if I'm frightened or repulsed by participating in a culture where the physical manifestations of death greet us at every turn. But I see something profoundly transformative in experiencing death as a social process and not just a biological one. In reality, the relationship between the living and the dead has its own drama in the US healthcare system, where decisions about how long to stretch the thread of life are made based on our emotional and social ties with the people around us, not just on medicine's ability to prolong life. We, like the Tarajans, base our decisions about life on the meanings and the definitions that we ascribe to death. So I'm not suggesting that anyone in this audience should run out and adopt the traditions of the Tarajans. Might be a little bit difficult to put into play in the United States. But I want to ask what we can gain from seeing physical death not only as a biological process, but as part of the greater human story. What would it be like to look on the expired human form with love? Because it's so intimately a part of who we all are. If we could expand our definition of death to encompass life, we could experience death as a part of life, and perhaps face death with something other than fear. Perhaps one of the answers to the challenges that are facing the US healthcare system, and particularly in the end-of-life care, is as simple as a shift in perspective. And the shift in perspective in this case would be to look at the social life of every death. It might help us recognize that the way we limit our conversation about death to something that's medical or biological is reflective of a larger culture that we all share of avoiding death, being afraid of talking about it. If we could entertain and value other kinds of knowledge about life, including other definitions of death, it has the potential to change the discussions that we have about the end of life. It could change the way that we die. But more importantly, it could transform the way that we live. Kuresubanga.
All right, so the video is pretty clear. We don't want to, I think, do what the Tarajans did. That's specific to their culture, and our culture is very different. But I do think the speaker is correct. Right? We should recognize that death isn't merely a biological phenomenon, but there are major social issues and social connections and social points of view that have to be considered too. I'll just leave that as food for thought. So you have a discussion, of course, and take a look at the videos beyond my lecture here. Think about it, think deeply about it, and get to that discussion. And good luck. Thank you all, and have a wonderful day.